Okay, it's 4 o'clock Pacific time. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Ellie, co-director of DIAG, Democrats for an Informed Approach to Gender. Thank you for joining us this evening. DIAG is a 501c3 nonprofit organization of lifelong Democratic voters working to depoliticize and shed light on the ideologically driven medical scandal and associated harms that have resulted from the adoption of gender ideology. We're building a movement to shift the prevailing narrative around the experimental, dangerous medical practices that comprise sex trait modification, euphemistically known as gender-affirming care, and to clear the path for a safer, saner, evidence-based response to gender distress. Please visit our website at diag.org. That's di-ag.org. Please check out our merch store, and if you'd like to help us continue and expand the work we're doing, please hit that donate button. DIAG believes in the liberal values of free speech and open discussion, which is part of why we host these spaces, to invite conversation on topics that have been left out of the public discourse. Today, we'll move quickly to listener questions. So if you'd like to start queuing up in another 10 or 15 minutes, we'll do that earlier than usual. First, I'm very excited to welcome our guest speakers today, Tomas Bogardus, Moti Gorin, and Leor Sapir. I'll let them go ahead and introduce themselves.
Are we going in alphabetical order, or what?
Yes, sure. Let's do that. That works.
All right, I'll go first. I'm Tomas Bogardus. I'm a professor of philosophy at Pepperdine University. So I'll share 2 prongs of my own research and then say a little bit about how I think those connect to what Leor and Moti are going to be talking about. So one prong of my research concerns those who think that traditional, ordinary, biologically based definitions of man and woman, male and female, are in fact false. So some people think that it's just false that women are adult human females and men are adult human males. So one thing I've done in my research is I have a paper evaluating arguments against that sort of biological view, including concerns that this kind of view is reductionistic or essentialist or somehow fails to account for intersex conditions. And what I try to show is that those arguments are not very good. And in fact, they're pretty bad. So if someone thinks that, as a matter of fact, women are not adult human females and men are not adult human males, then they probably don't have a good reason for that. Also, in the same vein, hopefully later this year, I'll have a short book out on the nature of biological sex, defending a functional account of the sexes. And in slogan form, that account is just that to be male is to have a body with the function of producing sperm. To be female is to have a body with the function of producing eggs. I defend this view against common objections, including concerns about infertile individuals, intersex individuals, postmenopausal women, embryos, simultaneous and sequential hermaphrodites, and so on. Okay, the second prong of my research concerns those who think that whether or not the traditional biological views of man and woman are true, nevertheless, those definitions should be changed in order to, among other things, respect everybody's self-identification, to affirm everybody's gender identity, we're told. So I have a paper out already arguing that no matter what the word woman means, it just can't be true that someone is a woman if and only if she identifies as a woman. Inevitably, there's going to be counterexamples to that. It's going to be possible to misidentify your gender identity, whatever that is. So if somebody wants to revise the word woman to mean something else, something other than adult human female, then there's just no way that this project is going to respect everybody's self-identification. So yeah, in that paper I say whatever it is that woman and man are going to mean on this revisionary proposal, we just can't respect everybody's self-identification. And I wrote that paper because I wasn't sure what was being proposed. I'm not sure what gender identity is supposed to be. Often, when gender identity is defined at all, it's defined circularly. But lately, I think I have a better idea of maybe what people are trying to say when they talk about gender identity. I think it might just be this. We're told that gender identity is somebody's internal sense of his or her own gender. But then if you ask what gender is, again, we don't often get clear answers. But I think it's just your psychological attitude towards masculinity and femininity. So if you're pro-masculinity and sort of neutral or anti-femininity, then we're going to call you a man. If you're sort of anti-both, then we're going to say you're non-binary. I think that might be what's going on with contemporary theories that talk about gender identity. And that's why there's, in principle, no limit to how many gender identities there could be, because there's no limit to how many attitudes a person could have towards masculinity and femininity. Okay, and I think this is where my work intersects with what Leor and Moti are working on. I'm working mostly in this sort of philosophical, conceptual arena. But in that arena, there are demands for certain kinds of accommodations. We're told that because of how a person identifies, because of this deeply held psychological attitude towards masculinity and femininity, certain treatments are in order. Such a person should be called man or woman or non-binary, so we should change our categorization of these people, or we should change the way we use pronouns. So certain kinds of treatments are recommended or requested or sometimes straight up demanded. And so I think that what we're going to talk about today is gender-affirming care in the medical arena, but I think that's just a subtype or an example of a broader request, which is for like gender-affirming treatment more generally. And you can think of examples in the social and legal spheres. Okay, and the second connection I noticed was, or the second connection I thought about with what Moti and Leor are working on is with regard to biological sex. I've noticed that when I talk about males having a function of producing sperm and females having a function of producing eggs, I notice there's a really high degree of resistance to the idea that our bodies have any kind of function at all. And what I'm thinking is that's because the idea that our bodies have functions is taken to conflict with our autonomy. So we here living in the wake of the Enlightenment are often repulsed by the idea that there are rules we didn't create or facts out there in the world that impose themselves on us. We'd like to be bosses of our own bodies. And so the suggestion that biological sex has something to do with function raises some people's hackles. Okay, and so what this new gender ideology demands, I think, actually is more than just autonomy. I think we're going a little bit beyond autonomy. I think what's being requested is not merely autonomy, not just a tolerance for our decisions, but in fact, affirmation of our decisions and social acceptance or participation with our decisions. And I think what Moti and Leor are going to talk about in the medical sphere is the expectation or demand that medical professionals participate in this sort of gender ideology. But what I'm trying to say is the connection with philosophy is we're seeing those sorts of requests in other areas as well, in social and linguistic forms of this request. And so that's what got my attention about 7 years ago when I started working on this. That's what I think is at the roots of all the most harmful consequences of this ideology. And I look forward to talking about it in the Q&A period.
Okay, I think Moti, you're up.
Yes, hi. I think I'm next alphabetically. Thank you, Ellie, for inviting me, and hello, Leor and Thomas. It's good to see you or hear from you. My name is Moti Gorin, and I am a philosophy professor at Colorado State University. So like Thomas, my formal training, my PhD is in philosophy, and I went on then, after getting my PhD, to do a postdoc in a Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy. And I started thinking about these issues probably about 6 years ago or so, due to some things that were going on in the academic discipline of philosophy. I'm assuming that many listeners here will be at least somewhat familiar with the story of Kathleen Stock, who was a philosophy professor at the University of Sussex. in the UK and who raised some objections to modifications to the some laws in the UK having to do with self-ID, gender recognition laws. And the discipline responded, people in general, many people responded very harshly to some things she had written that seemed eminently reasonable to me. I mean, what she had written seemed eminently reasonable. And some of the things that she touched upon in her essays was the field of pediatric medical care, gender transition in particular. And so I started looking into these treatments and what people had been writing about them, and became increasingly troubled by what I was seeing as a bioethicist. I'm sort of used to thinking about relationships between clinicians and other sorts of experts and patients, between researchers and those who they're conducting research on, right, subjects or participants. And both in the research ethics domain and in the clinical ethics domain, I found much to be desired in the arguments that philosophers and bioethicists were offering and in clinical practice itself. So that led me to think about one of the main themes that I've worked on. Had a paper come out recently on this, was on autonomy in pediatric in pediatric gender medicine. So there are, as I see it, two kind of major strands of argument that advocates of medical transition offer. The first is straightforwardly grounded in benefits. So we're all familiar with these arguments. The claims are that minors who are suffering from gender dysphoria or who are experiencing gender incongruence benefit greatly from a particular set of interventions, namely social transition, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and then sometimes, though more rarely, surgery. It's often claimed that these interventions are required in order to save the life of the patient, right? These are life-saving interventions, medications. They reduce anxiety, they reduce depression, and they allow the patient to live a fulfilling life, being who they are. The second strand of thought, which is becoming, I think, more and more dominant in discussions for a couple reasons. First, the claims regarding the evidence don't look very plausible. The more research that's done, the more it looks like these interventions maybe don't have the sorts of positive effects that early advocates hoped they would have. So a number of systematic reviews have been conducted in some European countries and most recently in the UK. And it just doesn't look like the evidence is there. It's not clear. It's far from clear, in fact, that the profile of these interventions, that the benefits outweigh the harms. And so I think against this background, we're getting a different kind of argument, which grounds the right of the child or the patient to these interventions, grounds it in their autonomy. So autonomy is, to sort of put it very generically, something like self-rule, our capacity to govern our lives as we see fit, to have control over our bodies, over the courses that we pursue, and so on. And the claim then is that it's not that important whether these interventions are in fact beneficial in terms of the health benefits they might provide, but they're really important for people for another reason, which is that they allow these people, these patients, to express or fully realize who they are. So these are patients who are said to have a gender identity that does not match their sex. They say sex assigned at birth. I think they just mean their sex. And in order to live true to who they are, they require these interventions. So it's not really a health-based argument. It's an argument grounded in self-determination. And I find that approach troubling. Generally speaking, in pediatric ethics, what comes first are the best interests of the child. So we don't let children make decisions in healthcare generally. Parents make decisions for their children in consultation with physicians and so on. But in this area of medicine, it's just taken to be, there's a core commitment that the patients know who they are, and we are supposed to organize care around that self-conception of the patient. And so you get some strange outcomes from that, like, 12-year-old girls claiming to be boys and getting, mastectomies or what have you, which struck me as extremely strange when I first encountered it. And anyway, so the autonomy-based arguments is one strand of my research. I'm now working on another project concerning the role of regret in clinical decision-making. So advocates of the affirming approach to medicine argue that rates of regret are really low, and this to them suggests that the interventions are beneficial and that we have no reason to worry. The idea being, if there was something harmful or bad about these interventions, we would see higher rates of regret. Critics or skeptics of the affirming model argue, correctly as it turns out, that we don't have very good research on regret rates, and then they hypothesize or they speculate that we're going to be seeing a high number of detransitioners. Regret rates are in fact high. We're just not tracking them. We need better data. And what I'm working on right now is a paper that's trying to assess whether we should care much about regret in any case. And I want to suggest that both sides are a little bit wrong. I don't think that regret is the right metric. I think that medical interventions are justified when they benefit people in terms of improving their health. There are all kinds of cases in life, we've probably all experienced them ourselves, where we might have benefited health-wise but come to regret the decision. And similarly, there are cases where somebody is harmed medically but does not regret it for all sorts of reasons. So I just don't think that regret ought to be playing the kind of role it is in these discussions. And I have some other projects that I've been thinking about for the future having to do with the purpose and the aims of medicine, because I think at bottom, one of the sort of really core questions at issue here is whether pediatric medical transitions are a form of medical care, or whether there's something else. We're using the tools of medicine, but not in the traditional manner, that being the use of these interventions to protect and promote health. And so this raises questions about what medicine is for, what doctors are for, and so forth. So those are some of the things that I've been thinking about. Happy to talk more, of course, during the Q&A, but I will turn things over now to Leor.
Thanks, Moti. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me on, and it's nice to be here. My name is Leor Sapir. I'm currently a fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. Have a PhD in political science from Boston College. I got my postdoctorate or did a year of postdoc at Harvard. And I got into this issue through my doctoral work, which dealt with a related aspect of the gender medicine debate, or you might call it a downstream consequences of gender medicine, which is Title IX regulation in schools. I did my comprehensive exams, finished my comprehensive exams, I should say, on the very same week that the Obama administration came out with a surprising Dear Colleague letter, which is a unilateral administrative rule that instructed all schools across the country to treat students according to their gender identity rather than what it was calling their sex assigned at birth. And what I found interesting about this document is, number one, that the Office for Civil Rights gave no explanation for its, let's call it, its philosophical anthropology, meaning why did it think that, the kind of conventional definition of sex is as it called it, a stereotype? Why did it think that humans have this thing called a gender identity? What is a gender identity? In what way can gender identity be distinguished from what it was calling stereotypes? It explained none of this stuff. And of course, that had direct practical consequences for schools in terms of compliance. And I found that very interesting. The second thing that fascinated me about this document was that the Obama administration was saying, this is nothing new. Title IX has always required schools to treat students according to their asserted gender as opposed to their actual sex. And because it's nothing new, we, the Office for Civil Rights, don't have to go through this arduous process of what's known as notice and comment rulemaking. And so there was a kind of a small c constitutional problem here of separation of powers. And then the third thing that interested me, just kind of stepping away from these, immediate legal institutional changes, was that, as kind of Thomas and Moti were alluding to, the philosophical basis for the entire gender identity movement struck me then and still strikes me now as just profoundly confused. The core ideas that animate the movement have either never really been fleshed out, or any attempt to flesh them out has resulted in contradiction. And contradiction to the point where, some of the leading advocates, at least 5-6 years ago, would openly admit that, there's kind of deep philosophical tensions within the movement's arguments, and it was not necessary to work these out. And I was struck by the idea that we don't have to have a clear idea of how we're reforming society in order to reform society. That's always struck me as a very, very bizarre idea. Towards the end of my postdoc, I got sucked in more and more to the medical side of the debate, because I noticed in all these lawsuits over Title IX that advocacy groups, plaintiffs, courts were citing medical literature and medical rationales. And so I started looking into the medical debate, to the medical research, which back then was not as voluminous as it is now. But, just like anybody who has spent, more than a couple hours looking at the medical research with a neutral, dispassionate eye, will notice the research is just extremely flawed. It's just not very good. And I think more importantly, the conclusions that are drawn from these studies are simply not supported by the study design. And then on top of that, these papers were being touted in mainstream media as showing even more than their own authors claimed for them. And so you get these narratives that, this is settled science. So 2020, 2021, this stuff was still talked about as settled science. I mean, GLAAD still has that truck that it, parks outside the offices of the New York Times. Gender affirming care is settled science. And it just struck me then how anybody with a scientific mind could possibly come to this conclusion. And so since then, I've written extensively on the poor quality of the research in this area of medicine. And I think in the last year, I've focused more and more on how this area of medicine deviates from principles of evidence-based medicine, which is a field that's existed for about 30 years and has a number of kind of core guiding principles. Some of it gets quite technical and complicated, but a lot of it is just common sense. So I think that the story of youth gender medicine, there are people, if you're thinking about master narratives, what explains all of this? Why did we arrive to where we are? Is a question that I get a lot, and I'm sure Moti and Thomas get a lot. And I've been resistant to these kind of single explanation master narratives. It's all queer theory leaking out of the academy. It's all money and capitalism. It's all groomers who are, trying to groom kids. I just don't buy that. I think that I think, first of all, that our medical establishment as an establishment, I'm not talking about individual actors or individual organizations, but as an establishment, as an institution, American medicine got caught up in this. I think that's the appropriate metaphor. It got caught up in this due to problems of a misplaced trust and deference where it wasn't due, a highly technical division of labor, in which doctors trusted their colleagues who claimed to have a special expertise in a certain area. So there were a series of a great many reasonable decisions that led to an unreasonable outcome. I think that's probably the best way to explain what we're living through right now. And this is really a story of institutional dysfunction, first and foremost. It's the dysfunction of medical institutions, of political institutions, of legal institutions. And I think I've come to understand that above all, this is a dysfunction of media. Because the role of media, of journalists, is to be the measure of last resort, the watchdogs. The ones who can, raise alarm when the rest of social institutions are not functioning as they should. And unfortunately, the media, not all media, of course, and I'm not going to say all left of center media, because that's definitely not true. There are left of center journalists who have been phenomenal on this issue, and from whom I've learned a lot too. But by and large, the media has failed. And so, yes, there are bad actors, there are incompetent actors, there are bad organizations and institutions, but these always exist in any society and on every issue. The test of a well-functioning society, I think, is how it deals with the problem of bad actors. And so, just to close with a couple thoughts, one question that's interested me is what explains the growing divide between the United States and European countries on this issue? Why is it that over the last 5-6 years, one European country after another has managed, health authorities there have managed to raise alarm, and in one way or another to slam the brakes on what is, I would say without hesitation, one of the worst medical scandals in the history of modern medicine. And I've argued that the explanation has mainly to do with the US political system and its political culture. So just to give a few examples, our decentralized healthcare system with its highly complicated public and private insurance scheme, its vulnerability to profit motives, although I think the profit motive side of this issue is greatly exaggerated. All of these things make it easy to adopt certain medical treatments and very difficult to reverse the practice once they're adopted. And that's actually characteristic of the American policy system in general. Policies are much easier to put into practice than they are to reverse. Anybody who has ever worked on welfare reform knows that. Not just welfare reform, any type of reform. The second thing that explains the big divide between the US and other countries is that even though other countries have a high degree of polarization, ideological polarization, here we have a high degree of ideological polarization that's overlaid by partisan polarization. And I think that the polarization of our parties has contributed a great deal to our inability to recognize that this is a problem and do something about it in a way that is not construed as, as partisan and narrow-minded. There are gender clinicians and gender organizations that go to great lengths to make sure that people know that a certain argument comes from a Republican or a right-wing think tank or some such. And of course, they do that because we as a society have become so partisan and so polarized that we take these types of statements as tribal cues, right? As kind of a smoke signal that says, don't get anywhere near that person. Don't look at what they're trying to show you, because if you do, then you are no longer part of our tribe. So that kind of tribalism, I think, is behind a lot of why the United States is so dug in. And then finally, and with this I'll end, is the civil rights state. It's a complicated concept, but it basically refers to a series of institutions, in particular courts, administrative agencies on both the federal and state level, and of laws, statutory laws, constitutional laws and rulings, administrative rules, that make it extremely difficult here in the United States to get any kind of reform. Just to give one example, one of the reasons why gender clinicians and organizations constantly refer to kids who get hormones and surgeries as transgender kids, as opposed to youth with gender dysphoria, which is how the more cautious European states tend to refer to them, is because if you use the language of transgender child, that triggers a bunch of legal and constitutional doctrines that have been long recognized by the American federal courts, goes all the way back to Brown versus Board of Education, and actually even further back than that. And that basically invites courts to apply a very high degree of scrutiny and to strike down laws that regulate in one way or another gender medicine. So that's just one example of how our institutions shape the way we think and talk about, in this case, youth gender medicine. So anyway, I'm looking forward to the discussion, looking forward to your questions. Thanks for having me again, and this should be good.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was, I think, a great kind of footing for our discussion. I started thinking about medical ethics when I did my deep dive, and I was wondering where the voices of ethicists were. I don't know if everybody does that, but I was thinking I expected these fiery public debates on the range of questionable aspects associated with this topic, but it really seemed pretty quiet. And, or maybe behind the scenes there are these ethicists coming to blows in hallways of academia or something over this, but and it's just not making it out into the public sphere. But I have a hard time believing that that's necessarily the case. So I guess my first question, we'll dive into audience questions really quickly, but my first question is this a contentious topic in terms of medical ethics? I mean, is it being discussed? Is it a contentious topic?
Maybe I can say something about that, as I think here the only sort of official bioethicist. I think it is a contentious topic in the following sense. There are many people who observe what's going on and who find what's going on to be quite troubling. There are many people who speak publicly who are strongly in support of what's going on. So in that sense, it's contentious, but it's not very publicly contentious. There's very few people in bioethics speaking out critically about these issues. And I think the reason for that is, this is something that Alex Byrne, who couldn't be here tonight, but he and I are writing a chapter on this. There's been an extremely hostile climate. The climate is extremely hostile for people who are critical of certain views. I mentioned the philosopher Kathleen Stock. She's not the only one, but that's one of the early stories. I mean, she started writing critically about sex and gender, including raising concerns about what was going on at the Tavistock in the UK, and of course, she's been completely vindicated there. But people in my own discipline wrote open letters. Hundreds of people signed. She was forced from her job. Similar things happened with philosopher Holly Lawford Smith, an Australian philosopher. There is a lot of silencing going on. There's a lot of risk to reputation. There are explicit efforts, openly, right, to just deplatform people. So if you try to put up, this just happened recently, I'm not going to get into too many details or name names, but you try to organize a panel on, let's say, philosophy and pediatric gender medicine, and people will refuse to participate if they learn that somebody like myself, who is critical, will be on the panel, right? Because they don't want to elevate certain voices. Their strategy is to not debate and not discuss. And I hear from bioethicists and philosophers, you get emails from people, hey, I read your paper, or hey, I saw something you wrote on Twitter. I think it's really important, but I don't want to speak out about it, but just wanted to let you know that, I think what you're doing is important. And if you talk to anybody, I'm sure Thomas has gotten similar emails and talking to people. So there's a climate of fear because the people both in the bioethics profession and philosophy and academia and outside of academia, in the lobby groups, the loud activists will make life difficult. You get slimed as a bigot. That can be reputationally harmful. You can end up on websites like Transgender Map, right, where you are called a bigot and your family members are named. And so it's not a very comfortable climate for people. And so the dissent, the criticism just does not rise to the surface. So while there are, I think, plenty of people who are critical, you just don't hear from them for self-interested reasons. Nobody really wants to step into it unless they have to. I think that's starting to change, and I expect that it will change, and we'll start hearing from more people as the Overton window opens up a little bit. But I think that's the explanation for why we don't hear, why we're not seeing those active debates, why we're not seeing leading bioethicists being quoted at MSNBC like they would be when we're talking about transplanting pig livers into human beings, right? Or when we're asking questions about abortion, even though abortion is extremely contentious, people are happy to talk about it publicly. Not so with pediatric gender medicine.
Yeah, and it's surprising. So I should say that we did invite 3 ethicists who have the probably the opposing perspective on this, and we didn't get any response. That doesn't necessarily mean that they saw our invitation, but we did make an effort to broaden the topic, broaden the speakers. So that's a little bit disappointing. So we will move to questions. If you have questions, go ahead and queue up. And I'm going to ask that if you're going to ask a question, please stick to the topic at hand. Also, please be brief and use your time to ask a question. If you have a statement to make, please use the chat function for that instead. Let's see, we want to give as many people as possible a chance to ask a question, so that might mean that we need to cut you off. And no, we'll definitely cut you off if you're not civil. Also, and this is important, we've encountered problems trying to shift listeners who would like to ask questions to speakers if they're not on a mobile device. So if you're having trouble getting elevated to speaker, it seems like we're not hearing you and you're not able to ask a question, just try logging out and logging back in, or post them in the chat and we'll try to get to them. Okay, let's go to our first question. Let's see. Oh, Ben Ryan, let's get you on. Hi, Ben. Yeah, you're on.
Oh, okay. Hi. Sorry, there's noise in my gym. But my question is for Leor. I know that in the Supreme Court case that is going to be heard next term about Tennessee's ban on their pediatric gender care ban, that one of the questions that the ACLU is hoping to get answered is that there is indeed, quote unquote, strict scrutiny for the class of transgender kids, per se. And so, as I understand it, that question has not been answered by the court. So how is it you're suggesting that that group, when it's named as such, as trans kids, does invite strict scrutiny, as you were saying?
Yeah, it's a great question, and kudos to you for answering it from the gym, or asking it from the gym, rather. So this requires a little bit of legal history background just to understand the context. Until 1938, the Supreme Court's jurisprudence on equal protection, so the 14th Amendment, was basically that any law that regulated economic activity would be subject to a very high standard of judicial review, meaning courts would look very carefully at the rationale, if there was a solid justification, and would often strike down these laws. And of course, famously, they did that with FDR's New Deal, forcing a crisis and FDR threatening to pack the courts. He lost that battle but won the war when the Supreme Court basically flipped and agreed to no longer strike down economic regulation, allowing the New Deal to go into place. Now, in 1938, you get a Supreme Court decision called Caroline Products United States versus Caroline Products. And in a famous footnote number 4, the Supreme Court turned on its head its previous jurisprudence. And it said, from now on, we are no longer going to be striking down economic regulation or reviewing economic regulation under strict scrutiny. We're going to be using strict scrutiny for laws that target or have an effect on discrete and insular minorities. Discrete and insular minorities. And that term was then borrowed in the Brown versus Board of Education case to strike down school segregation. And of course, Brown versus Board of Education became kind of the founding. It's at the heart of the ethos of the modern legal movement, and it's the most prestigious decision, certainly of the 20th century, arguably of all of American history. And it elevated in prestige and in power the entire legal profession. And so what that did was first of all, it created the foundation for the modern civil rights state, but it also gave a language to reformers, to social reformers, to try to frame the types of reforms, social reforms that they wanted. So the women's movement, for example, argued in the 1960s that they should be entitled to the same, that laws that distinguish between the sexes should be entitled to the same degree of scrutiny as laws that distinguish between race, because women, sex is an innate and mutable property, just like race, and therefore women are also, they're not a minority, but they're a discrete social category. In other words, you start seeing this chain of reasoning by analogy. All of a sudden, everybody becomes like African Americans. Everything is like race. And then later on, everything is like sex. And this is the same thing that happened with the gay rights revolution. You saw these constant analogies to race and to sex, even though obviously it's different. And in the same way, the transgender revolution in law, and it began very much in law, what we're seeing now is the consequence of about 4 or 5 decades of legal advocacy, also started making those types of analogies. And so now to get to your question, Ben, the reason why this term transgender kids is used so frequently in American political discourse, especially by legal advocacy groups like ACLU and Lambda Legal and so on and so forth, it's not just because they want to be respectful towards kids that they perceive as being trans. It's because it has direct consequences for litigation. If you can persuade a judge that there is a discrete and insular category of humans that is affected by, for example, state laws that restrict certain medical interventions to people age 18 and over, and that category of people is what's known as a suspect class or a quasi-suspect class. These are technical legal terms. You are basically convincing the court to look at age restriction laws through a much more exacting lens. And that's exactly when or why judges will start asking, how good is the evidence that states have to regulate these practices? If you can't get a judge to apply that level of scrutiny, then the level of scrutiny that applies is called rational basis review, which basically says, as long as a state can articulate any type of standard or any justification for a law, as long as it's minimally rational, we, the courts, are not going to strike it down. We're not going to intervene because we're not the democratically elected branch of government. So just to summarize, this concept, transgender youth, even though it obviously has a lot of cultural meaning, it is a legal concept, a constitutional concept with extremely important constitutional implications. And so that's why, I urge, when I speak to journalists and researchers and medical professionals, I just want them to understand that when they're using this term, they are contributing to a legal argument, to a constitutional argument, whether they know it or not.
I guess I had thought you had said it was a sort of a matter of settled law as opposed to an aspiring constitutional concept or argument, which is what it is now.
Sorry, say that again?
Oh, I when you were speaking earlier, I had thought you were suggesting that this was already a settled fact that they were indeed a quasi, I forgot the word, suspect class.
Yeah, so there are certainly federal circuit courts that have said that. For example, the Fourth Federal Circuit Court has found, I think in the Gavin Grimm case, it reached that conclusion. I don't know that the Supreme Court said that in the Bostock case. I mean, Bostock was technically not a constitutional case; it's a Title VII case. I don't think that the court said that.
They didn't, as far as my recent reporting.
Yeah, I don't think that they did. And so this question of, is being transgender an innate property of persons? Is it like race? Is it like sex? That's a philosophical question, but when asked in a legal forum, especially when dealing with constitutional litigation, the answer to that question will determine what degree of scrutiny a court will apply. And as they say, strict scrutiny is strict in theory and fatal in practice, meaning any court that applies strict scrutiny is almost certain to strike down a law.
Do you guys mind if I interject just some of what I've learned from the Attorney General of Tennessee?
Please.
Yeah.
Okay. So I spoke with, so he's the one, it's Tennessee, he's the one who will be defending, or his Solicitor General will be defending before the Supreme Court the ban in that state for pediatric gender transition treatment. So the basic argument from both the Biden Justice Department, and it's their complaint that the court has accepted, as well as ACLU, is that this is a matter of sex-based discrimination, sex and gender being sort of one and the same in this concept, because you can give puberty blockers to cisgender children for other purposes, for precocious puberty and so on, and why can't you give it to transgender children for gender dysphoria? And so the defense from Tennessee is that no, that's comparing apples to oranges, but apples to apples is that we have an age cutoff. We're allowing them for people over 18, but forbidding them for people under 18. Therefore, this is an age discrimination, but age doesn't count under the 14th Amendment as being a part of the Equal Protection Clause. Therefore, the answer is no, and you don't even need to go and answer those latter questions of whether or not there's rational view, et cetera.
Yeah, so it's true that age is not what's called a suspect classification, at least not that I know of, under any Supreme Court decision that I'm aware of. And it's also true, I don't want to comment on what the Tennessee Attorney General's legal strategy is, because I frankly don't know, but it's also true that the ACLU and other legal advocacy organizations have tried. They've tried a number of legal theories. One of them being that these types of regulations or laws are a transgender discrimination per se, meaning they discriminate on the basis of transgender status. I think that's a hard argument to make, and I think and it also assumes that the court is willing to see transgender as a quasi or fully suspect status. But another argument that they've tried is that these laws discriminate on the basis of sex in the classic understanding of that term, which bizarrely they also then go along to go ahead and deny. Right? They say that there's no such thing as sex. But regardless, and that argument I think fails as well. You can think of, for example, Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act imports Title IX into healthcare law and basically says the healthcare providers may not discriminate on the basis of sex. And the Obama and Biden administration issued rules interpreting that to mean that if you offer double mastectomies for women with breast cancer, you also have to offer double mastectomies to women who identify as men, because failure to do so means treating somebody different but for their gender identity, which they say is synonymous or trumps sex. So, and of course that doesn't work in this context because, both boys and girls are being denied access to puberty blockers. So there's no facial discrimination on the basis of sex here. I think all of these legal theories are just workarounds to get to the real issue, which is we don't want the state to regulate pediatric gender medicine, right? There's kind of the legal abstractions that distract from the main issue rather than clarify it.
So another thing that I was told is that people believe that the reason at least 4 justices agreed to hear the case in Tennessee and to hear it this quickly before many of the other cases have been decided within the federal courts in other states is that they wanted to, quote unquote, this is a theory, a clean up Bostock, meaning that Bostock applied to employment, and it was about the Civil Rights Act. So does it apply in other contexts, in particular, in this case, healthcare, or, might it apply to what you're suggesting at Section 5057, et cetera?
Yep.
So at least in theory, the justices are looking to narrow as opposed to sort of, keep broad what was found in Bostock, in which everyone was very surprised because Gorsuch, was the lead author of the case and he's so conservative, but he found this textual reason for deciding, for the plaintiffs in that case.
Yeah, so that is one theory, and it's definitely possible. Another possible reason they granted cert to the Spermetti case is because it's possible that the conservative justices believe that that Trump will get elected in November, and assuming he does, it's almost guaranteed that the DOJ is going to withdraw its support for the case. In which case, the whole premise of the case goes away because the only case that the Supreme Court agreed to grant cert to was the appeal by the United States, not the appeal to by the ACLU. So anyway, it's anybody's guess. This is all just guesswork.
Okay, I'm going to jump in, and we have one question. I also have a question about, how, now we're getting into the legal realm of this, and I've listened to a lot of these hearings. I've never seen a medical ethicist weigh in on this, so I don't know where ethics, if is ethics just a basis as part of law, maybe, or policy that you wouldn't have an ethicist. But how does the fact that even these terms that are being used, like gender or life saving, that seem to shift around or aren't really defined at all, how does that allow for policy decisions or medical ethics or in any of these fields, that shifting landscape?
I'm not sure, Ellie, if I quite understood the question. Leor just gave and explained, I think, in good detail why the term transgender kids is so important legally. There are other words and phrases that also turn out to be really important legally and also for insurance purposes. So if you can claim that a treatment is medically necessary, that has a particular meaning where health insurance companies are going to pay for those services. They're going to pay for those interventions. So that's why you'll see this claim repeated. It's in WPATH guidelines. Well, WPATH guidelines are interesting. They talk about gender incongruence, but when they start talking more about coverage, they switch to gender dysphoria because there's a code for that for purposes of payment. So medically necessary is another example where it looks on the face of it like it has an everyday meaning, like, oh, it's necessary to protect your health or to treat a disease or something like that, but it has a technical meaning for purposes of insurance coverage. So the language here is extremely important. It's important in the pediatric medical domain. It's really important with broader discussions of sex and gender having to do with who counts as a woman or a man for purposes of inclusion in sports, for purposes of inclusion in the in women's prisons, and so on. So a lot of these fights that we're seeing are about language because the language has direct implication and consequences for policy and for public spaces and so forth.
I think I can answer your question in terms of what will happen with the Supreme Court case. So if the Supreme Court says, like, no, this is not a violation of the 14th Amendment, it sort of ends there. It's very easy. There's just the slightest, you just have to be, I can't remember the exact term of this, but essentially you can't be like completely capricious and arbitrary about making these rules. And that's the lowest bar to clear. But if they do decide that that it is a violation, or that indeed transgender children are a suspect class, then that raises the bar. And in that case, you would go back to the lower courts and you would start to hear all of these arguments about the medical necessity and have they proved their point. So the bar wouldn't be impossible to scale for the defendants, for the attorneys general of the various states. but it would be harder. And then that's when you would get really into the weeds over all of these uses of terms like medically necessary and whether, in fact, those terms have been defended by science.
Yeah, I just see this as being a really fraught, when you have this moving target, how the public interprets it, how doctors interpret it, how our legislators interpret this. I'm going to go. We have a question from someone who posted in the chat, and this is for Leor. When asked for randomized controlled trials or similar with regards to treatments in gender affirming care, I've seen many people on the other side say that for most medical treatments we accept the lack of randomized controlled trials. So an undue burden is being placed on gender affirming care. How would you respond to that? There was a recent article from Australia which mentioned that roughly 90% of all medical care lacks high quality evidence.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, and I just want to point out before I answer it, this represents a victory of those of us who have been fighting for greater honesty and clarity and truth on this issue. Because until about 2022, maybe early 2023 even, it was fairly common to see claims about gender affirming care being supported by settled science or robust science or high quality science. And what happened around that time was a kind of a pivot. I think the face of that pivot is a doctor at Yale University Medical School named Meredith McNamara, who was kind of brought onto the scene by transgender advocacy organizations, it seems, right around that time in order to kind of orchestrate the pivot, especially around lawsuits in Arizona and Texas. And the new argument became, yeah, gender affirming care is a low quality evidence area of medicine, but that's true of most areas of pediatrics. And so you meaning those of us who are in favor of reform, are singling out gender affirming care, thus showing that what's really driving this is bias and prejudice and animus, as opposed to a genuine concern with medical science and ethics. So that's kind of that's the argument, right? And that is the argument that's now being put before the courts. That is one of the most important arguments made in the so-called Yale report that was published a couple months ago in response to the Cass review. Yes, it's low quality, but so what? So let me say a couple things about randomized controlled trials, and then I'll come back to this question of quality of evidence and how that relates to strength of recommendations in evidence-based medicine. It is true that I'll just say EBM. In EBM, randomized controlled trials are typically necessary to produce high quality evidence, although we have to keep in mind that quality of evidence is not the same thing as quality of studies. Let's just distinguish between those two things, but I'll just use the shorthand quality of evidence for now. Many treatments in pediatrics are indeed not supported by high quality evidence. That's true. A lot of that has to do with the fact that kids are not ethically able to consent to participate in randomized controlled trials, an assumption from which kind of gender clinicians never draw the obvious conclusion, but let's leave that aside. And so on its face, I can understand why people think that there's a double standard here. But, first of all, I think it's important just to take a step back and recognize the fact that we are now talking about whether randomized controlled trials are possible and whether they're ethical is in and of itself a very important shift in the debate over gender medicine. We weren't talking about this a few years ago because the other side was saying, oh, the science is settled. More to the point, I think it's probably true that randomized controlled trials in this area wouldn't be easy to do, but I think they're definitely possible to do. You would probably have to use some kind of active comparator. I think there is a way to control with placebo. Double blinding is probably going to be difficult, just because if you give one group puberty blockers and the other placebo, or one group cross-sex hormones and the other, especially testosterone, and the other placebo, within a few months, they're going to start noticing the difference. But I think you could probably see some mental health consequences, or at least you can hypothesize that there will be mental health consequences within those first 3 to 6 months before the physical effects of these hormonal interventions are made evident or not. But I think equally important, what's interesting to me is that there's broad agreement among participants in this debate that RCTs, randomized control trials, shouldn't be done. There are different arguments for why they should not be done, but there seems to be agreement. On one side, it's argued that that it would be unethical to deprive kids of puberty blockers and give them placebo instead, or some active comparator like psychotherapy, because we already know that puberty blockers are medically necessary for, let's say, reducing depression and suicidality. Right. Never mind that the whole reason we want an RCT is to know whether they're medically necessary. Right. They begin from the conclusion and then reason their way from the conclusion to saying that RCTs would therefore be unethical. And on the other side of the debate, it's claimed that we've already had 30, 40 years of, not 30, 40 years, but 20 plus years of what amounts to an uncontrolled experiment where kids were being given these drugs, and the results of these studies are less than impressive. And so it's unethical to, given all the risks, the medical and health risks and the long-term uncertainties of what these drugs do, it would be unethical to give them to kids, and also kids can't consent to them. They can't consent to giving away their fertility, for example. But I think the most important point here on the RCT front is, I think, as opposed to other types of medical interventions for which there very well may be low quality, the conceptual framework of illness and health is what's really at issue here. Because the kids to whom puberty blockers are being given, or cross-sex hormones, or for that matter, surgeries, are physically healthy. There's nothing wrong with them physically. And some of them, probably even from a mental health standpoint, they are relatively well-functioning, relatively okay. Whereas if you are trying a new, diabetes drug that you don't want to experiment on children, diabetes is an objective health condition that has actual dire health consequences, potentially fatal. So there's a conceptual framework of health and disease. There's objective diagnostic tests in which you can distinguish kids who are sick from kids who are healthy. And none of that exists in the case of transgender medicine. It's all based on the subjective feelings of the child in the moment. And then, so just to conclude, getting back to this question of guideline, strength of evidence is connected to the question of strength of recommendation. The strength of the evidence is not the only thing that determines whether you give a strong or a weak recommendation, but it's one factor. And the argument that, clinicians like Meredith McNamara have been making is, look, there's a strong recommendation in pediatrics, and she says this in her legal briefs, and this example has appeared in court rulings. There's a strong recommendation in the field of pediatrics against giving aspirin to young children who have a fever, because aspirin is linked to a neurological condition called Ray's syndrome, which is an aggressive neurological condition that can result in death. The problem is that there is low quality evidence linking aspirin to Ray's syndrome. So here you have a situation in which there's a strong recommendation based on low quality evidence. And so McNamara says, we do it with aspirin. Why can't we do the same thing with gender affirming care? Well, the obvious answer is, or at least one answer is, there's a quick and easy alternative to aspirin. You can give them Tylenol or ibuprofen, and it's going to do the exact same thing, but it's not linked in any way, shape, or form to Ray's syndrome. It doesn't have the properties that could result in Ray's syndrome. So the analogy just breaks down on those grounds alone. And so, these analogies are meant to appeal to judges who have no background in evidence-based medicine, whose only information comes to them from plaintiffs who carefully choose their expert witnesses, who are themselves chosen because they have highly partisan and biased perspectives. So sorry, that was a very long-winded answer, but it has become the central argument of the gender establishment, and it's important to understand what its inherent weaknesses are.
Could I follow up with just a brief comment to what Leor just said?
Of course.
So yeah, I think everything Leor said was spot on, and I think the way to think about this question of whether RCTs are necessary, which is really the central question there, is whether we need strong evidence or high quality evidence, as that's understood in evidence-based medicine, in order to justify these treatments. And I think what we often lose track of here is that what we're really asking about here, and this is what Leor was getting at, are risk-benefit profiles. So you can have the weak evidence but a strong recommendation. It's called a discordant recommendation if certain conditions are met. And so let me just give you a make-believe example. If there is a child who is diagnosed with an aggressive tumor, this is a life-threatening condition. We know it's life-threatening. We know kids who get this tumor, have high rates of morbidity. It's very likely this child is going to die. And suppose there's some study that comes out that says, if you reduce sugar, we have a study showing that reduced sugar intake in mice seems to prevent tumors from growing quickly. It's an animal study, or maybe it's a human study, but it's really weak. We didn't have any controls. It wasn't an RCT. It was a cross-sectional design, really weak, small number of participants, okay? But if we cut sugar, maybe the tumor will, can we recommend, that you cut sugar? Sure, right? Because the kid is going to die, and there are no harmful side effects to cutting sugar. I mean, my kid might differ, but you get the point. So we're talking about risk-benefit profiles. In the case of sex trait modification, we're talking about giving kids who are uncontroversially physically healthy. Nobody denies that, right? Even the people who argue to depathologize argue that these kids are healthy. And the proposal is that we block their puberty and or give them cross-sex hormones and or perform various sorts of surgeries on them. And we know, right, that some of the effects of these interventions are harmful. So we know there are risks to fertility. In fact, this is supposed to be part of the consent form. This is the information that families are supposed to be given, right? We know this is a risk. We know fertility is at risk. We know that if somebody has a mastectomy, they're not going to be able to breastfeed later in life. So there are known harms, uncontroversially, right? So in those cases, weak evidence just isn't enough. If there was some crappy study saying that if you give a kid chamomile tea, that can improve their gender dysphoria, doctors should go ahead and prescribe the chamomile tea. You could have a strong recommendation for chamomile tea, right, absent some allergy, even on weak evidence that chamomile tea is effective. So we really need to focus on the risk-benefit profiles of the intervention in question as compared to alternatives, one of which is doing nothing. And so it's really risk-benefit profiles that we need to be focused on, as opposed to just the weakness or the strength of the evidence.
Yeah, let me just add one thing to that. And that is that the fact that we're dealing with young children adds an additional complication that actually from an EBM perspective, okay, so just to back up, if you think about the question of what is a harm, is losing your breasts, let's say losing your ability to breastfeed as a woman, is that a harm? Well, it could be a harm. In evidence-based medicine, there's a concept called values and preferences. And when guideline developers are developing recommendations, the quality of evidence is one factor they take into account. But what links the quality of evidence to the direction and strength of recommendations is called values and preferences. And this refers to the kind of the expected values and preferences of the typical patient in that situation. And so, take the example of sterility. Is it, if you are sterilized, is that a harm? Well, if I'm having a vasectomy, that's not a harm. That's the very purpose for which I'm getting the procedure, right? So it's actually a benefit. It's not a harm. But the problem is, of course, that 12-year-olds cannot autonomously, ethically, figure out for themselves whether these health consequences, these physiological consequences, are in fact going to be benefits or harms. So if you're taking even, or I should say especially, the most liberal approach, and I mean that in the ideological sense of the word liberal, if you're taking the most liberal approach to youth gender medicine, I think you would have to say that precisely because we don't know, in the case of every particular child, whether some side effect like permanent sterility or loss of ability to breastfeed or some such is a harm or not, you have to you have to revert to understanding this being as not being fully autonomous or not being autonomous at all. And of course, gender clinicians recognize that implicitly when they say, oh, but the parents are the ones who are involved and decide. Let's leave aside just how much autonomy and informed consent exists vis-a-vis the parents. But that is a complication for the use of an EBM framework for debating youth gender medicine. Now, of course, there are some health consequences that are, I think, undeniably harms, like heightened risk of cancer. I don't think anybody would, in good conscience and good faith, argue that cancer can be a benefit depending on your values and preferences.
Okay, we have Disa. Let's see, Disa Sachs. Did
Yes.
you ask a question?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm a physician, and I've only come to study this the last, I would say, 2.5 years. But I've read everything I could get my hands on, and I'm horrified that we're not attacking it a little bit more from what you brought up a little earlier, that psychiatry is notorious for having not a single objective test for any of their diagnoses. There's not a single lab test, there's not a single imaging study, there's not a biopsy. And the example that everyone brings up, but I don't see it being hammered home enough, is for the 11-year-old anorexic young girl who insists that she needs to have her stomach stapled even though she's 60 pounds. A doctor who did it because the child knows herself the best. And, like, in other words, there are other parallels where a psychiatric diagnosis does not allow you to do butchery. You'd be in jail. I don't know what, you'd lose your license for sure if you did that. Why are we focusing more on the fact that there is no objectivity here? We're talking about children, and go after it from that angle, as opposed to making it out like it's the same as a child with a brain tumor. And that's why I think they started with the lies about the suicide rate, because imminent death is one of the only reasons that you can use an unaccepted off-label thing for, if someone's has 6 weeks to live, you can try something that isn't really has weak evidence or whatever, because I think that's one of the reasons they went with that suicide lie, because the imminent death thing is something doctors are accustomed to using crappy evidence to do something. But that's been established that there is no increased suicide risk. So I think hammering them at their weakness, which is they have no objectivity to anything they're saying, and therefore the highest bar for the medical ethics part should be playing so much more of a role than getting bogged down in these legal things that these trans activist lawyers, many of whom don't have children and aren't dealing with it with a young, healthy kid. It's getting so abstract and away from the fact that from a medical perspective, we have analogies for where psychiatric problems don't get treated with butchery and permanent sterilization or permanent damage to a child's healthy body. And it seems to me we have to get more doctors to talk about it from a medical ethics. Like, every guardrail and norm and standard in the practice of medicine has been obliterated here. Instead, we're like in the Supreme Court. Like, what other medical? It's not even medical; it's psychiatric. So, what other thing gets put into the Supreme Court? Like, why are we going to the Supreme Court instead of insisting that medical norms and standards be? Anyway, I think I made is that clear question?
Yeah, I think you're asking why in this case don't we follow the standard medical norms and ethics.
Right, like this is so outrageous for any, I can't. So, like, when I first came onto this subject, I have a personal reason for being onto this subject. it's torn my family apart. I have a daughter who's an MD, MPH at one of the most prestigious universities in the country. She's an editor at one of the most prestigious journals. And she's gay. She's married to a surgeon who does these procedures. And when I first started learning about it, I didn't know anything about it. And I started with the rapid onset gender dysphoria with Lisa Lippman's work. And when I was totally unbiased about it, I didn't know anything about it. And I spoke to my daughter, who I'm extremely close to and adore, and asked her to send me the literature so that I can learn about it. And her reaction was so appalling to me. She said, "Why do you care? Why are you interested in this?" And I said, "You're asking your mother, who's a physician, who has always been so comfortable with gay issues, and like, you're asking me why I'm concerned. I'm concerned because there's a new phenomenon with a lot of young girls, never heard of it before in young women." Like, and she wouldn't send me the literature, and she got all like prickly about it, which was so out of it was so jarring to me, not only because I know her, but because that's when I realized something's really wrong here. And it's a medical ethics problem. Much more, it's become a legal quagmire because the doctors have really just fallen down on their responsibility. I mean, it's just insane to me what's going on, because there are parallels. Psychiatry is notorious for doing this. They did it with lobotomies. They do it with ECT. They are notorious for having non-objective diagnoses, completely subjective, for which they do things that have no basic science to go with it. There's no good clinical data to go with it. And I think doctors have to be more aggressive about fighting this on medical grounds.
But could I maybe make the case for the other side here a little bit? Not because I endorse it, but because I think it's important to at least understand the rationale. And so the history here is that, the Dutch protocol, this model for treating youth, started in the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. They had been treating at the clinic adult, at the time they were called transsexual patients, who even after transitioning still weren't doing very well in terms of their mental health. So there were still high suicide rates. There was still a lot of depression, anxiety. They weren't flourishing. And the reason that they weren't flourishing, right, it was hypothesized, was because they weren't passing very well. These were middle-aged males, and they weren't passing as female. And due to the kind of stigma that attends being transsexual, transgender, they weren't flourishing. And so they thought, well, wait a minute. This time in the 80s, we started using puberty blockers for precocious puberty. And they had an idea in the Netherlands. They said, well, wait a minute. If we can intervene earlier, right, if we can block endogenous puberty and then give the cross-sex hormones, these individuals are going to mature and they're going to pass much more easily. And they're going to end up psychologically healthier than our current cohort of adult late transitioning patients. That was the fundamental rationale for starting earlier. It was the failure of the adult transitioners to pass well. It was hypothesized that it was the failure to pass well that was leading to psychiatric morbidity. So let's start earlier. And there we can take a male, start at age 10, start at age 12. And if the individual goes through all three stages that were studied at the time, right, blockers followed by cross-sex hormones followed by surgery, you're going to get a convincing female appearance. And that person is going to be able to fit into society, be perceived as a female, and live their life and flourish. That was the rationale. There really was psychiatric morbidity that they were trying to treat.
Psychiatric morbidity is another one of those words that, what does that mean? What is psychiatric morbidity mean? Are they going to jump off are they killing themselves? Is that
yes. Yeah, they're killing themselves. They're depressed. They're anxious. They're not leaving the house. They're having a hard time in their romantic relationships. They're having a hard time holding jobs. They're not doing well. They're the kind of patients that psychiatrists and psychologists worry about.
Can I ask? Okay, let me just do a follow-up question. My thinking about it is, I don't think that we're dealing with good faith people on the other side now. I don't know what it was like in the 80s because I wasn't my area of expertise. But the fact that we cannot get doctors on the other side to debate openly with Leor, with you, with physicians who feel strongly that there's a real something very wrong going on here. That's a big red flag that they know they don't have a leg to stand on. That this is ideologically driven, not looking out for the best interests of the patient driven. Because I've never seen a situation where doctors don't discuss. I think when it started to be an explosion in the early 2010s, to me, the first thing that good faith actors would have done is go to their IRBs, especially for the girls, because that was the new cohort, and do careful studies on the worst cases. Instead, it was no IRBs, no studies, pedal to the metal, and let's just trans everybody. And to me, that's like declaring I'm not a good faith actor, because that is not the norm or standard in any field of medicine. They're the ones who have breached all standards here. And they seem to be getting the deference instead of like, whoa, it's outrageous. They have, like, why weren't there studies done in the early 2010s on these girls, the worst cases, in a careful, controlled study that went through IRB? There was none of that. Instead, it was, let's open 300 pediatric gender clinics in every corner of the country and trans everybody.
But if I can just interject here just for 1 second, I think that there's Adisa, you might be slightly mischaracterizing how this whole field evolved, even beyond kind of the important history that Moti gave. This is very much a story of kind of incremental steps where each step, kind of nobody quite knew where it would lead, except for maybe a few people who knew and hoped. But this was intended from the very beginning to be an extremely rare, exceptional type of intervention. If you read the early Dutch literature, they don't quite frame it as an experiment, but they do seem to understand it as an experiment. There's a lot of hypothesizing there. What happened was that during the 2010s, it got caught up in a new type of cultural, I don't want to call it a revolution, but a kind of a cultural shift, especially around issues of identity. I think the mixture of this medical procedure with the gay rights movement was extremely important. Being able to say that trans kids are just like gay kids, it's the new version of gay. And therefore, anybody who has any kind of solicitude towards gay people, which is most Americans, most people across the West, ipso facto has to have solicitude and has to be on the side of trans kids. And once you believe that there are such a thing as trans kids, then it's very hard to deny that trans kids should get trans medicine. So I'm very sympathetic to your kind of, why are medical professionals not speaking out and saying this is like giving liposuction to an anorexic girl? I'm very sympathetic to that. But the truth of the matter is that for a bunch of reasons, some of them having to do with analogies to gay rights, some of them having to do with the incrementalism that has allowed this to develop to where it is today. For a bunch of reasons, I think our institutions, our medical institutions, political institutions, Democrats have climbed so far up the tree that for the last few years, the challenge has been to offer them a ladder to get down. The challenge has been to get them to back away step by step. You're not going to take Democrats who have, vowed in public speeches to protect trans kids at all costs. You're not going to get people like that to instantly flip and say, wait a second, what are we doing here? Why shouldn't we treat this like an anorexic girl who's asking for liposuction? That's just not going to happen. And so we do have to make these kind of cautious arguments. We do have to, sow the seed of doubt in people who are convinced that this is life-saving, medically necessary care. We just don't have a choice. Look, you can have the billboard Chris's go out into the street with signs and say, no child is transgender, no kid should get purity blockers. Great. Some people will be persuaded by that. But, if you want to persuade those who got caught up in this, I use that metaphor again, who got caught up in this, those who are in the middle, those who think that this is the natural extension of gay rights, you have to do it carefully and incrementally. And you have to use these technical concepts and you have to kind of meet them where they are. There's really no choice but to do that.
I see that practically, but that's, medically it's not an argument, but it's a political argument. And because of the increase in the number of fellowship programs for pediatric gynecology, pediatric urology, the plastic surgery subspecialists, now you have a whole new fleet of young doctors who need patients. All of the programs need patients. This is a political. This is no longer a medical discussion that we're having about what's best for children. It's now I understand. I hear what you're saying, and I understand that, and I have no doubt that originally the Dutch psychiatrists were thinking about how to make their adult patients do not have that as many adult patients who don't pass. But clearly, we're not dealing with good faith actors right now who are worried about these kids. And I'm not saying that there's never a child. I mean, the original cohort was so tiny. I mean, I always knew that it existed, but we never. It was such a tiny percentage of the population that I don't know. I just think there has to be a better way to, like, how do you deal with young surgeons who have spent a fortune more in energy, time, and devoted to this? A lot of them are queer. Self-identify as queer. It's a huge industry now, but that's not really a medical argument about what's best for children. What's best for a 12-year-old girl who comes home from school and tells her mother that her name is Mark. I mean,
Disa, I'm going to jump off of that point. There are two questions, but I'll jump off of your point first, which has to do with, whether or not this is medicine. And, I've noticed this shift in calling. It used to be we were patients, and then we're slowly becoming clients. And, is that tied into whether or not medicine, the typical ethical approach to medicine, isn't really kind of applying the way that we would expect it to here?
That's a great point. I would say that as medicine has devolved to becoming, the doctors are now owned by hospital corporations, and they have to make the patient the client happy, as you said. The whole patient-doctor relationship has changed so drastically that we're now trying to apply do no harm and old-fashioned, what's always been the brick and mortar of medicine, has gone out the window on almost every level, and yet we're still trying to. Maybe that explains why we're in the legal system instead of in the medical system, because the medical system's fallen apart. Like, it was never perfect, but this is. I think you're right. I think you nailed it. I think that's probably why it's this bad.
Okay, Disa, we're going to move on to some other questions here. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. So 2 more questions. In the U.S., the parents. So one thing I want to say is that I've got a comment from Carol, who I have the utmost respect for, and her comment is about the fact that these discussions are always focused on children, whereas, as DIAG, we say that everybody deserves evidence-based care, but clearly the focus is on children, and I'm interested in the ethical aspect of treating or giving these interventions to adults as well. Is the bodily autonomy issue or the embodiment goals, all of that direction, does that preclude focusing at all about what happens to someone who is over 18? And we do see, a large number of young people in the 18 to 24 or, further on, falling into this and being harmed. So, can we move beyond the focus on children here, or is it just a dead end because of the bodily autonomy issue?
Well, I think the autonomy issue is really important here. we treat children differently in medicine and in other walks of life differently for a reason. We don't let them make their own decisions, whereas we tend to allow adults to make many of their own decisions. That doesn't mean that there are no ethical questions to ask about transgender medicine in the adult case. You might ask, for example, if there aren't clear medical benefits, maybe we should allow adults to receive these treatments, but who should pay, right? Should we treat this like like a cosmetic intervention? We allow adults to undergo cosmetic treatments. We typically don't pay for those out of insurance policies. We don't, Medicare doesn't cover those, and so forth. So we can still ask questions. But another consideration here is that the physiological effects are just different on children. They haven't fully developed. So there are concerns and questions about cognitive development and the role of puberty and in cognitive development, and what happens when you block puberty or what happens when you give cross-sex hormones. Those questions aren't as pressing in the case of adults who have already fully developed sexually and physiologically. We are talking about interventions that can lead to infertility for people who haven't yet developed. In some cases, in the case of the boys, they haven't developed their fertility yet. So it's not just. I think the autonomy piece it explains why we don't focus as much on adults, although there are questions there. But it's not only that. It's that the interventions are in certain respects riskier and more life shaping for young kids than they are for adults.
Okay, great. Yeah. Carol, if you want to weigh in, you're certainly welcome to. Here's one for Thomas. In the U.S., the parents are mostly concerned about whether or not their own children are secretly changing their pronouns at school. But in the UK, Helen Joyce argues that forcing children to use wrong sex pronouns for others, even if they don't suffer from gender distress themselves, is a safeguarding issue. Can we keep children safe in school if we are lying to them about what makes someone male or female? Do we need more debate in the U.S. to reframe this as a safeguarding issue rather than a matter of etiquette?
Okay, well, I was trying to write that down as you spoke, but maybe you'll have to repeat it for me. So
Sure.
It seemed like we got a question at the end, which was, can we keep children safe in school if we're lying to them about what sex is?
Right.
What was the rest of the question?
And then, do we need more debate in the U.S. to reframe this as a safeguarding issue rather than a matter of etiquette?
Oh, so yeah, maybe the question is, would it be more politically shrewd or politically advantageous to reframe this as a safeguarding issue? And I guess what's at issue is we're not keeping children safe if we're lying to them about what biological sex is. And the question is, maybe that would be politically a smarter strategy to approach it that way.
I think both politically and obviously we don't want to be telling children that sex doesn't matter or that it's not a real thing.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah, I guess one question I'm not disagreeing with the questioner, but I'm just wondering, what is it that what risk are we putting children at by encouraging the use of revisionary pronouns? What is the risk exactly? I'm just genuinely wondering. Or maybe the idea is just, well, we're just lying to them and sort of indoctrinating them into a series of falsehoods about what biological sex is, and that in itself is the harm, that we're just lying to them. If the question is what would be most politically expedient, which way of framing the issue, I guess, gosh, I don't know. That's a good question for a political scientist. But I think that if we're wondering, like, should we, as a matter of fact, use revisionary pronouns, would we be engaged in lying or dishonesty? I mean, that's something I've been thinking about recently. I'm working on a paper right now about the ethics of pronouns. And to be honest, although this might upset some people in the audience, like, I'm not sure if the revisionary use of pronouns is asking us to engage in falsehoods. They're rather asking us to track something besides biological sex. to like change the way that we're speaking so that we're no longer tracking biological sex in conversation, but we're tracking something else, people's attitudes towards masculinity and femininity, maybe. In that case, we're not being asked to lie, I think. But what I've been thinking lately is it still may be that I myself and maybe people in the audience feel that we're not morally obligated to participate in this sort of system, even if it's not asking us to lie. It may be that by adopting revisionary pronouns, we're sort of participating in an ideology that we ourselves do not agree with and that we consider pernicious in various ways. And so here's just one analogy. I like what Leor says about people being really captured by analogies and people leaning heavily on what sort of analogies they find convincing. But here's one analogy. So I wouldn't ask my own children to say, peace be upon him after any mention of Muhammad, the alleged prophet Muhammad. I wouldn't ask them to say that. And that's because, like, independent of whether Islam is true or false, like, we're simply not part of that belief system. We're not part of that religion. And to use that sort of language is to signal that we are a part of that system. We are a part of that ideology. We do sort of agree with it. And so I think something similar might be happening when we're asked to participate in these pronoun rituals or to change the way that we use pronouns. Even if you think, like, I'm not being asked to participate in lying or dishonesty, I am being asked to participate in an ideology that I myself do not agree with and that I consider pernicious in various ways. And so just as I don't think the state should force us to say things like peace be upon him after any mention of Muhammad, I would have thought the state and public schools in general shouldn't force children to participate in ideologies that they themselves do not accept. So those are some thoughts I had in response to that question.
Can I just ask, Thomas, can I ask you to clarify something? So it seems to me that the concern about lying could be one of two things or both together. It could be, let's call it the moral status of the agent, meaning you as the person who's being asked to lie, but also the consequences of what you say for someone else, in this case, let's say a child. And it seems to me that even if you understand that, by participating in the ritual, because you were saying, like, you can understand that when you're using he for a biological female, you're not referring to their actual sex, but to their, let's say, social presentation of sex, or what we would maybe call gender. Nevertheless, the child might not understand it in the way that you do. For instance, because the child has been, indoctrinated to believe that there is no such thing as sex, that sex is just a mishmash of character traits and dispositions and body types and functions and all that kind of stuff, right? The kind of the whole, it's all a complicated amalgam. It's all on a spectrum. And that a person's internal sense of being male or female is a person's sex. In other words, if they come at this with, gender ideology already programmed into them, then by using the pronouns, you're not necessarily lying, but you are definitely participating in a lie, if that makes sense. So even before we pivot to the coercion question, which is important, I think there's more to unpack on the lying front, isn't there?
Yeah, so you're saying, so if a biological female says, please use he, him pronouns for me. And I understand that what they're asking me to do is not assert that she is male. That's not what they're asking me to do. This person knows that she is not male. What this person's asking me to do rather is to revise my use of pronouns to track this internal psychological state that she has. She has a gender identity of a man or whatever. So I'm being asked to track that instead. And so I guess what you're saying, Leor, is if I understand that, and if I were to elect to use pronouns in that way, I myself would not be lying, but I would be signaling to others something like approval or participation in a broader ideology that I myself, as a matter of fact, me, Tomas Bogardus, I think is false in many ways and pernicious in many ways. Yeah, I think that's right. And so that's why I would elect not to do that. even though I'm not being asked to lie in the moment with this particular statement, I am being asked to signal a sort of positive attitude towards an ideology that I don't accept and that I think is false in many ways and dangerous in many ways. So, in that way, it's sort of like why I don't say peace be upon him after any mention of Muhammad, even though I guess I do wish peace on everyone. I don't want to say that because it would signal to others that I am a member of a religion that I'm in fact not a member of and that I think is false in various ways. So that's why I don't say peace be upon him after mentioning Muhammad, even though Muslims would like me to do it. They would feel much better if I were to do it. And even though I think, strictly speaking, it's not a bad thing to wish upon somebody, I don't want to signal my participation or affirmation of that belief system. And so in a similar way, when I'm asked to participate in a system where pronouns are tracking something other than biological sex, I guess like after a whole lot of mental gymnastics and calculation, I can figure out what I'm being asked to say. I'd simply rather not, because I understand that it's part of a larger system that I myself reject and think is dangerous. And so, that might be reason enough not to encourage kids to do it, or to get the state involved in the public school system, encouraging them to do it, because we will thereby be raising the kids or indoctrinating the kids to participate in a system that we think is pernicious and dangerous. And false, I should say. Yeah, false in various ways.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Be more, Jane. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, but I've got a bit of a preamble, which I think is it's always the case with this subject. If I can.
We have a couple people lined up, so brief would be.
Okay, I'll try and be quick. So, I mean, okay, we're kind of ignoring the elephant in the room, which is the middle-aged men. But I mean, we also know that, and this is established going back to Green, that a lot of the gender non-conforming kids who ended up on this route, and that includes arguably the first Dutch study patient, were individuals suffering from either social and familial homophobia or egostonic homophobia, egostonic homosexuality. I'm wondering whether there are arguments to be made that by introducing these concepts, especially to youth who are in the development of their sexual identity, we can argue that we are creating a rise in ego-dystonic homosexuality in youth. And when I say youth, I mean up until 30 or so. And then, there's obviously this problem with the Dutch of the motivations. Sure, there were comorbidities, but how did they, and they didn't, I know, how do they separate out passing versus, impaired function, the inability to form intimate relationships and pair bond and so forth? So I wonder, I guess, can the argument be made in sort of the fight back that this is really making being gay much harder, especially for kids when they are already in a sexual minority, and that is already a real minority stress issue? On what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
Okay, anybody want to take that?
I mean, just for my part, I think there are people who are very worried about this. If you read Hannah Barnes's book, Time to Think, I mean, she described how there were therapists at JIDS in the UK who were shocked at the amount of homophobia they were encountering from families of patients and from the patients themselves, internalized homophobia. And people have pointed out, and I think this is important and correct, that so much of the talk about so-called conversion therapy, right? So there's some advocates of the affirming model will claim that exploratory therapy is a form of conversion therapy. I think the case is much stronger that in at least many cases, medical transition is a form of gay conversion therapy. So I'm clearly not the first person to say that. Many people think that, and there are real worries, especially when it comes to the girls, the lesbians, who, for lots of reasons, having to do with living in a sexist society, want to escape womanhood. And one additional reason they might have is if they are a woman or will be a woman who is same-sex attracted. So I think this is a really important point. We know that rates of same-sex attraction among kids who transition are really high. And I think this is a place of real tension that should be exploited by those of us who are skeptical or critical of these interventions. I think it's a really bad thing to try to convert somebody's sexuality, and if that is what's going on, if you're taking a gay girl and turning her into a straight boy, and if the reason for that is grounded in homophobia, then we have some, I think, a strong argument to apply a lot more caution.
Yeah, I would just add one thing that I think I read once, and I think Andrew Sullivan said this, and that is that, you know, for kids who are not gay, for heterosexual kids, the fact of their sex is just kind of a background fact, right? When I was a 12, 13, 14-year-old boy, I didn't walk around all day thinking, I'm a boy, I'm a boy, I'm a boy, right? It was just kind of in the background of my consciousness. But for gay boys and lesbians at that age, who are just starting to have feelings that incline them towards members of their own sex, and especially boys who are more effeminate, there are kind of some of these more natural doubts about their sex, and they do get bullied and they get questioned by other kids if they really are members of their own sex because they behave or have desires that are consistent with what's expected of the opposite sex. And so Andrew Sullivan's point is like, you know, actually gay kids need to be affirmed as members of their own sex. We do need sex affirming care or gender affirming care, but we have to be affirming gay kids as actual members of their own sex because they're constantly hearing or hearing doubts that they're not. So yeah, I do think, you know, the research shows us that gay kids are heavily overrepresented among gender dysphoric kids and kids who transition. Trans activists say that gender identity and sexual orientation are completely distinct phenomena that should never be conflated. Of course, that can't possibly be true because sexual orientation has quote unquote gender identity components to it, and probably the other way around too. But I think, you know, there's going to be a day of reckoning at some point in the future where kind of the gay, I hate to use the word gay community because there's no such thing. There's gay communities where gay communities will say, how could we have done this to ourselves, to our own? But I think we're still far from that day.
Well, I think also, Leor, that speaks to a point you made earlier about the distinction between quote unquote trans child and a child with gender dysphoria. So what you've sort of just described is a form of gender dysphoria that arises from one's sexuality. And so one can be gay and have gender dysphoria because one is gay and working through those issues. And so it's just a mistake to conflate having gender dysphoria on the one hand with being transgender on the other hand.
Okay. We're going to move to Carol. Go ahead, Carol.
Thank you. So I know this can be a little difficult to pick apart, so I'm going to start. I'm concerned that you're ignoring the safeguarding issues, especially with adults. The vast majority of the adults I've known and worked with who have detransitioned or even still transitioned are suffering from severe mental illness. And gender dysphoria is a diagnosis in the DSM. You go into a therapist, and a therapist is diagnosing you with this, and the treatment given is transition. So where exactly is the choice in this? These people who are mentally ill are going to therapists, and therapists are transitioning them. So where's the medical ethics there? Where's the safeguarding? I'm sure most of you have heard that horrible story of the young man. He was 20 years old who had a psychotic break and had his genitals removed. And he came to and went, what the hell just happened? There's absolutely zero safeguarding for adults who are mentally ill. And since when do we use um, a mental health diagnosis and then cut people's bodies up to fix the mental health diagnosis? Isn't that an ethical issue too? And yes, adults can choose. And I agree with the cosmetic surgery route. If an adult wants to do cosmetic surgery and pay out of their own pocket, well, fine, whatever. But this is not what's happening. This is a medical treatment being prescribed to mentally ill people. So I would like your all's take on that. Thanks.
I mean, I suppose what I would say here is, there seem to be cases where it's pretty clear cut that an adult simply is in no position to give a free and informed consent. In other words, this is a kind of coercion. Those strike me as the quote unquote easy cases, meaning the cases where the ethical dimension is less ambiguous. From a purely political standpoint, and this is a question I get a lot, not always publicly, sometimes privately. Why do we seem to not be paying attention to the adults and to all the harms that they suffer and the lack of safeguarding in adult medicine? And it's a completely fair question because there are appalling things happening in adult medicine. Think of like the shapeshifter case that's now in court in Massachusetts. An immigrant who was really kind of taken in by this ideology and coercively treated by the Fenway Health Clinic and underwent full medical transition, only to realize he's just a gay dude, and he just needed to be, supported and as a gay man. From a purely political perspective, I think it's pretty easy to see why figuring out the problem with transitioning kids and how to solve it is just more urgent, and there's just more of an ability to do that than with adults. There are counter arguments to that. Don't get me wrong; I've heard them, but I just think from a purely political perspective, like we have to start where we can, and that is trying to reform pediatric gender medicine. But there's no doubt in my mind. You can already see, kind of inclinations of this in the Cass review, where they talk about 18 to 25-year-olds. We know that the brain doesn't finish developing until your mid-20s. We know that adults, even above age 25, with severe mental health problems, sometimes in a state of psychosis, are being prescribed hormones and given surgeries. And that obviously can't be allowed to stand. The problem is that every time you raise these types of objections, you have, I think, very dishonest trans activists who say, you see, this whole thing about kids, that was really just a prelude. That was just a way to get the public invested in your position, because what you ultimately want to do is come after all trans medicine because you don't want there to be trans people. And that, we have to be sensitive to the fact that there are going to be people in the middle, people who need to be persuaded, researchers, journalists, scientists, medical professionals, institutional leaders who are taken in by that argument. And we have to take it seriously. We can't just dismiss it. And so I'm of the opinion that, adults, mature adults who are mentally competent should be allowed to choose to transition, provided they give full informed consent and they are given all the relevant, highly up-to-date information about their condition and about what different treatment pathways exist and what they can and cannot do. But we're nowhere even close to that happening right now.
Okay, let's go to Letta Lestrange. You're muted, so.
Sorry about that. I was messing with my headphones. I apologize because I have a little throat bug. I hope everybody can hear me. I work in an inpatient psych unit. I have since 2017, and for about the past year, I've been working almost exclusively on the youth side, which means I've taken care of more trans-identified people than most folks have shaken hands with. And besides the almost universal truth that they are extremely vulnerable for various reasons, I just wanted to say that playing the pronoun game, it is not a neutral act. And while it might come at a cost to the person who doesn't believe, I do think that the comparison to saying peace be unto Muhammad is a good one. But besides that, as professionals, we do things that we don't always necessarily agree with wholeheartedly as you're trying to suss out other factors and having to keep that person safe and de-escalated. However, particularly as it relates to medicine, particularly as it relates to school, it's a deeply unethical thing to go along with for the reason that it is not a psychologically neutral act. It is the equivalent of affirming to an anorexic that they are in fact fat and that it's not important that they eat. And as anybody who's worked in mental health is aware, anorexia is an incredibly difficult illness to treat, similar to a trans identity. I also would like to say that there are two different factors at play here. One being that gender dysphoria is real. It used to be considered to be something like body dysmorphia. As things have become more and more standalone diagnoses, which they've done that for purposes of billing, we've sort of lost the history and lost the connection. But to have gender dysphoria, especially within the adult population, does not equal having a trans identity. Because a trans identity seeks to externalize that internal pain. It seeks to establish an external locus of control. And in that way, we are creating people with personality disorders, particularly among youth and young adults. And in that way, we are setting people up for a lifetime of high conflict and an inability to maintain solid relationships. So if we're talking about the ethical matter behind this, I think it's really important that as professionals and people in the know, we stand up to the pronouns, because we are not doing any of these people with gender dysphoria or a trans identity, we are doing them no favors by going along with it.
Okay, I didn't hear a question there. Was there a question?
Not really, just a statement.
Well, I'll just chime in. Maybe that was directed towards me. I took myself to be answering a sort of subtle question, like when we're asked to participate in the revisionary pronouns, are we being asked to say something false? And is that why it would be wrong to participate? I certainly think that we shouldn't lie and we should be honest. But what I was saying was, it may be that the most charitable interpretation of what we're being asked to do is not say something false, but to say something really unorthodox and unconventional. We're being asked to change our language in various ways so that pronouns don't track sex, they track something else. And then I was answering the question, like, if that's the case, would it still be wrong to participate in pronouns, the pronoun agenda, the pronoun game? And what I tried to say, and I'll try to be clearer now, was yes, I think so. Even if I'm not being asked to lie or be dishonest, I still think I'm certainly not obligated to participate in the revisionary pronouns. And in fact, I think I'm obligated not to participate in using revisionary pronouns, because it would signal to my conversation partner and anyone else who's around that I agree with, assent to, affirm this sort of contemporary gender ideology that I myself think is pernicious and dangerous in various ways, and I'd rather not signal any sort of agreement with that. And I think that the speaker, I'm sorry, I forgot her name, put her finger on something important, namely that this ideology is bad for people. It has really harmful consequences for people, and that in itself is a reason not to participate in it in any way.
Okay, we're pretty much out of time here. We're going to go quickly to Beth. I'm sorry, I know we have a lot of people queued up and some people online, but we're down to a minute. So Beth, can you ask a quick question and then we'll close up?
Okay, just yes, quickly, when they're talking about safeguarding, and the speaker just talked about that, we have to remember that young children are very concrete, and they can't handle abstract concepts like gender being different than sex. So if we are going, as someone who's raised two children and knowing also the statistics on child sex abuse, we have to have kids be safeguarded. They have to know the difference between male and female. then it's not okay for a male to be in their bathroom. It's not okay for a male to be around when they're changing. They need to run away. They need to get away from that situation. So when we confuse kids when they're 5, 6, 7, even younger, about what sex and gender is, we are leaving them wide open to predators. And that is a horrible ethical problem. And secondly, I would say that it would be nice to have nice, rational conversations about medical ethics and the whole issue of gender transition. But the problem is whenever we try to do that, whenever I've seen anybody try to do that on a rational basis, they are shouted down and attacked by violent and enraged males and other trans rights activists. So that is good and that's a goal, but it has not been able to happen, and I don't see it happening anytime soon. Thank you.
Yeah, I think what Beth points out is really important here. Namely, I think it's good to reflect on why it is that we, as English speakers, embedded in our grammar a way of tracking biological sex. Like, why did we do that? Why did we think that biological sex was so important and mattered so much that we would consistently reflect it in the grammar of our language and track it in that way? And I think what Beth points out is probably, just from my position here in the armchair, I would think that one of the reasons is males tend to be more dangerous than females due to testosterone and socialization and so on. And so it's important to sort of keep track of the sexes so that for various purposes we might segregate them for safety. And by indoctrinating children in a system where we erase that distinction and teach them not to track that, I think what Beth was saying was we're kind of setting them up to be victims of perhaps sexual assault in the worst case. And so, yeah, I think it's worth reflecting on why we track sex with pronouns and what would be lost if we stopped doing that. So there's another reason not to participate in the revisionary pronoun system.
Okay. Can we squeeze one more question in? Okay. All right. Kat, let's get you in. Go ahead. You're muted, but you should be able to speak.
Are you talking to me?
Yes.
Oh, just a couple of quick questions. Following up on one of the early speakers, I couldn't see any other healthcare in any other type of healthcare other than gender healthcare where the medical model is ignored. Is that true? That's the first question.
Can you say a bit about what you mean about the medical model? I'm not sure what you're referring to exactly.
Well, look, if you look at a traditional medical model, you've got evidence-based medicine. The patients are treated unless there's strong evidence that the treatment's likely to help or likely to harm them. There's a diagnosis process. You've got a case formulation, then you've got evidence-based treatment, then you follow up to see whether or not it's been effective or beneficial or not, and there's certain standards. But when you look at the gender-affirming care model, there's no requirement for diagnosis, it's just a health declaration. There's lack of high-quality evidence. There's denied the need for high-quality evidence. I think in Australia, they don't want to do any randomised controlled trials of any sort. That's just no. There's no way to define benefits of it, and it's driven by political demand, and there's a whole bunch of associated beliefs around gender affirmation and influence from therapy approaches. I can't see any other healthcare section category that ignores the traditional medical model. Essentially, only the gender-affirming care model. Is that true?
So you were cutting out a bit, but I think I understood your question. So as I said early on, there are two different, broadly speaking, there are two different kinds of argument that are offered on the gender affirmation side. The first is just the medical model, the one you just described, right? The claim just is that these interventions protect and promote health. And the people who make that argument are relying on the same kinds of arguments you would make if you're trying to reduce morbidity from cancer. You're trying to treat or cure cancer. The second strand of argument, the autonomy-based argument, that's where I think really starts pushing beyond the medical model. And that's what I've written about recently. I think those arguments don't work, but I think we're going to see those arguments more and more as it becomes clear to more and more people that the evidence isn't there to support the kind of medical model. And there, if you want to know, are there other areas of medicine? I mean, cosmetic interventions are the closest, right? There,
Okay.
right? So there you have something like a comparable model where people come in and just say, I want my breasts to look different. It's not that I'm experiencing pain. Some women get reductions because it's uncomfortable, it's causing the pain. No, I'm talking about your standard kind of Los Angeles rhinoplasty, right? So I think we can look to cosmetic interventions as a kind of comparison, and so I would think that that's one area where there is a similarity.
Attack that. Thank you. Now, the second quick question is actually to Tomas Bogard when he was talking about pronouns, etc. We down here, what we did is we approached two states, Tasmania and WA, with telling all the schools that they were engaging in a breach of duty of care. Because if the schools instruct students in gender ideology and allow them to go to social transitioning, it's almost always that it leads to medical transition. In other words, like one of the speakers was saying, this is an actually intervention. It's not, it's not just something that happens, etc. And hence, because it leads to medical transitioning and there's a whole bunch of harms related to that, then they are literally putting the children on harm. Is that not? We got a lot of response. We got like 96 to 90% open and read rate to our emails to those schools. Have you guys in the States or Canada, wherever you're coming from, taken that approach?
Okay, so this question does seem to be about like what sort of political action would be most prudent and whether a certain kind of political action is most effective, or if there's another one that's more effective?
It's not just political approach, because each school, I don't know what America's like, you do have this concept of duty of care. That's very much embedded in the school system, a duty of care. You cannot put a child on a pathway of harm. And social transition in particular without parental knowledge. And if you're doing things like promoting ideologies or mandating pronoun usage, or if they're into gender affirming practitioners, you are literally putting them on a pathway of harm.
Yeah.
So it's not just a political action. It is an action we took politically, but it is based on something which I noticed. I went through all the school curriculums in all the states in Australia, and no duty of care was mentioned around this topic of gender ideology, which raised big flags for me to have a look at that.
Yeah, so I certainly think it's true that by indoctrinating children into this gender ideology, I would guess that you're raising the probability that these children are going to engage and end up being medically transitioned, seeking all sorts of surgery and puberty blockers and so on. I would think the odds go up if we indoctrinate students in that way. But I think this might be a better question for someone who's more aware of like what sort of legal and regulatory levers we have at our disposal to try to get schools to change their policies. And if this would be,
I can try to offer a few thoughts on that. Here in the United States, this entire debate, to the extent you can call it that, around schools has happened through the highly abstract language of rights, in particular civil rights. And our civil rights laws and traditions and legal precedents have really dominated the discussion and also dominated the kind of the policy realities on the ground. So, by and large, this is how, kind of stakeholders who support social transition in school think about it. They say, well, these are trans kids. Every kid has a gender identity. Trans kids have a gender identity that doesn't align with their sex. And our civil rights laws, as interpreted by the courts, as interpreted by the Biden and Obama administrations, have told us, the schools, that as a requirement of being in compliance with Title IX, that's 1972 law, we have to treat students consistent with their gender identity. In other words, you don't even get into the therapeutic debate. You don't even get into the kind of medical literature on social transition, on iatrogenic harm, whether it's a psychological intervention or not. There are a number of lawsuits across the country now. I've filed an amicus brief in 4 of them that, where parents are suing schools for doing secret gender transition, secret social transition of their kids. And, the argument that I try to make in the brief is, setting aside all the legal issues, if you look at this from a question of psychological intervention, this is a psychological intervention with real potential for harm. The difficulty is getting judges, but maybe more immediately getting school administrators, school boards, school lawyers to even consider it as a question of mental health intervention. And what's bizarre is that activists and schools that are kind of aligned with activist priorities, which is, I hate to say it, but I think most school districts, they make 2 claims that are just totally contradictory. On the one hand, they say, well, it's no big deal. It's just a matter of showing respect and being inclusive, right? All these kind of very abstract euphemisms. But at the same time, when you push back, they say, oh no, if you don't do this, these kids are going to get depressed, they're going to get suicidal, they won't be able to function at school, and so on and so forth. So they just kind of lily hop between those 2 arguments, depending on which one is most convenient in the moment. And I'm not saying they do that consciously out of some like nefarious strategy. I think most of the people operating in these schools and promoting these policies or defending them just haven't thought about these things very deeply. They do it because they want to be kind, because they want to appear virtuous, and that's pretty much where it ends.
Okay, well, we're a couple minutes over now, so we're going to wrap up. I think we could all, engage in this discussion for hours because it's a massive topic and a massive issue. But we're going to wrap it up. I'd like to thank our guests, Tomas Bogardus, Moti Gorin, and Leor Sapir. You can find them all over the place, YouTube and on X, but please be sure to follow them on X. Their handles are in the space announcement. I don't know if you all want to say something before we close it off. Closing statements, or should we just...
Well, just thank you for having us on, and this was a great discussion, and thank everybody who came here to listen and ask questions. Thank you all for being here.
I'd also like to thank you for inviting me. It was nice hearing these questions and having this conversation, and I really appreciate and admire what you all are up to, and I'm glad if I could help out in any way.
I am also very grateful for the invitation, Ellie. Thank you. Thank you for the questions, and for those of you who are listening. I was hoping to ask Leor about the presidential election and what he thinks there, but I know we're out of time. That's a big issue.
Come back and do that one next week. But maybe let's try and do this again in a couple of months and revisit some of the topics that we didn't get to. A lot of questions left over. So if you haven't already done so, please join DIAG at di-ag.org/join. Our power to reach our representatives is through our numbers. So it's important to show that we are not a fringe cohort of the party, but a silent majority who still believes in science, ethics, ethical evidence-based medicine, civil discourse, the rights of women and girls to sex-based spaces, honors and opportunities, LGBT rights, and a compassionate, reality-based society. Thank you all for joining us, and have a good rest of your evening.